Some people seem to have the world at their feet, until one moment shatters everything they've built. Ethan Miller was once a name that made waves across Seattle's tech scene. At just 34, he had founded and led a multi-million-dollar startup. TED Talks, cover stories in major magazines, first-class flights across the globe. His life was painted in the vivid colors of success and ambition. He had it all: wealth, recognition, a sleek smart home overlooking the lake, and a stunning girlfriend named Sienna, who always stood beside him at galas and charity events. But then a rainy night and one fateful curve on the road took away the movement in Ethan's legs. The car spun off the road, skidding across wet grass and flipping violently. Ethan survived, but life as he knew it did not. From that moment on, silence took over. The smart home, once buzzing with laughter and online meetings, now echoed with mechanical beeps and unbearable stillness. Ethan slowly became a ghost of the man he once was, sinking deeper into isolation. Sienna, the woman who once held his hand in front of cameras, began fading into the background, as if she could no longer see the man he had become. And just when Ethan believed he would remain imprisoned in that luxurious glass box forever, a different kind of door quietly opened. Sienna never said goodbye. She just disappeared, little by little, like a light fading at the end of a tunnel. She still visited, still smiled for brief moments, but her gaze never lingered. As her presence grew fainter, Ethan no longer tried to hold on. The wound had sunk too deep, and silence had become his final armor. Then one Monday morning, as rain tapped gently against the windows, a new voice echoed through the house that had long been too familiar with loneliness. "Good morning, Mr. Miller. I'm Leah Carter." She entered his life unannounced. No noise, no scent of expensive perfume like Sienna, no echoing heels across the marble floor. Just a neat figure, brown hair tied back, and eyes that held something steady, gentle, and quietly unshakable. Leah wasn't a certified nurse. She had taken on countless jobs to raise her daughter, caring for seniors, cleaning homes, working behind a pharmacy counter. But she carried with her a kind of calm Ethan couldn't quite name. She didn't lower her eyes, and she didn't look at him like a patient. She looked at him as a human being, without pity, without expectation. Ethan didn't need anyone. That's what he'd told himself 100 times. But now a stranger was walking through his home, preparing breakfast, checking his medication, and asking questions that made him uncomfortable because they were far too genuine. Leah didn't try to bond. She simply did her work. Quietly, precisely, without judgment. And in her eyes, Ethan saw something rare, something he had forgotten, the true presence of another human being. And though he refused to admit it, that presence unsettled him. In the early days, Ethan referred to Leah with a single word: "You." When he had to answer, it was with clipped phrases like, "All right," "No need," or worse, long, suffocating silences. He viewed her presence as a contractual intrusion, a service he never wanted but was now forced to endure. Leah didn't react. She didn't force a smile, didn't try to make small talk, didn't fill the silence with empty stories. She simply did her work. Her calm, instead of comforting him, irritated Ethan, as if she were too grounded to be rattled by the coldness he hurled her way. He thought if he was cruel enough, she would quit. But Leah didn't quit. Every morning she arrived on time, made coffee like it was a ritual, checked his medication, and cleaned with the attentiveness of someone caring for her own home. She never asked personal questions, but her eyes, those steady, unflinching eyes, somehow made Ethan feel seen in a way he wasn't used to. The hardest part for him wasn't the physical pain, it was enduring the quiet kindness of a stranger. During morning baths, when Ethan felt the most vulnerable, Leah always moved with quiet respect. No unnecessary motions, no awkward words. She would simply say, "I'll start from the shoulders, okay? Let me know if it hurts." Steam fogged the room. The scent of peppermint oil lingered in the air. Leah washed each part of his body with gentle yet assured movements. Her hands weren't just performing a task, they were listening. Even without words, she seemed to read the smallest twitches, the faintest muscle shifts. Once, Ethan asked curtly, "Why don't you ever ask questions?" Leah paused, then gave a faint smile. "Because I think you'll talk when you're ready, and if not, I'll still be here." That answer disarmed Ethan, not because it was poetic, but because it was deeply real. As time passed, Ethan noticed he no longer waited for Leah to leave. He began listening for her soft footsteps in the house. The clatter of pans in the kitchen wasn't noise anymore, it was life. One afternoon, when she left early because her daughter had a fever, the house returned to its old silence. And he felt something missing. He didn't say it, but Leah seemed to know. The next morning she arrived earlier than usual. In her hand was a coffee cup from the cafe Ethan used to visit daily when he was still walking. She placed it by his bedside and said quietly, "I remembered you liked this one." Ethan looked at the coffee, then at her. He said nothing, but for the first time his eyes were no longer cold. What grew between them didn't start with a grand moment. There were no cinematic breakthroughs, just small things, a more carefully folded blanket, a simple word spoken at the right time, a gaze that offered dignity in moments of deepest vulnerability. The change came like wind, soft but undeniable. At first, Sophie wasn't allowed at Ethan's house. Leah always arranged for a neighbor to watch her or dropped her off at daycare. But life doesn't always follow plans, and one rainy morning, Leah arrived with her daughter in tow, looking apologetic. "The sitter's sick. I didn't want to miss work. I'll keep her in the living room. She won't bother anyone." Ethan gave a reluctant nod. He didn't like kids. They were too loud, too curious, and asked questions adults didn't want to answer. But Sophie wasn't what he expected. She stepped into the sterile silence of the house like a breeze of spring, gentle but full of life. In a lemon-yellow raincoat with bouncing brown curls and bright eyes, she looked like she belonged to a different world entirely. Sophie didn't ask Ethan anything, not about the wheelchair, not about why he couldn't walk. She simply looked at him for a long moment, then tilted her head. "I think your legs are just asleep. My mom says if something's been sleeping too long, we have to wake it up gently." Ethan nearly laughed, but he held it back. Instead, he turned away, hiding the strange flicker that had just stirred inside him. After that, Sophie started showing up more often, not because Leah insisted, but because Ethan stopped protesting. One day, Leah asked, "Would it be all right if Sophie came today?" And Ethan simply replied, "Bring her coloring books." From then on, Sophie had a corner in the living room where she drew pictures of dragons, mermaids, and a man in a wheelchair with wings growing from his back. "This is you flying off to a magic world," she explained with complete seriousness. Ethan stared at the picture, then laughed, a low, gravelly sound, real and unexpected. Leah glanced out from the kitchen, and in that brief moment, she knew. Something had shifted. Sophie never held back. She sat beside Ethan during his physical therapy, whispering encouragement as if casting spells. "Come on, Mr. Ethan, you've got this. Every time you lift your leg, you level up." She created a metal system out of colored paper. Every time Ethan completed an exercise, she'd secretly stick a star on his bedside table. Ethan never mentioned it, but he always smiled when he saw it. One afternoon, while Leah was doing laundry, Sophie sat on the floor playing professional massage. Her tiny hands gently moved along Ethan's legs. "My mom does it like this. I want to try." Ethan, who used to hate being touched, sat still. No flinch, no withdrawal. Just quiet, watching the little girl with softened eyes. When Leah returned and saw them, she froze, but Ethan simply said, "This kid has her own way." The atmosphere in the house shifted little by little. The silence wasn't oppressive anymore. It was punctuated by crayon strokes, bedtime stories, and sometimes Ethan's deep laugh breaking through the quiet. 3 people, 3 different worlds, slowly beginning to blend. No labels, no promises, just closeness. One evening, while Leah tidied up, Sophie leaned in and whispered, "Mom, Mr. Ethan was really sad before we came here, wasn't he?" Leah paused, looking at her daughter. "Yes, sweetheart." Sophie nodded, then smiled. "Then we're in the right place." Change didn't arrive like a cinematic moment, no magical flash of light, no dramatic breakthrough. It came quietly, like a ray of sun slipping through a window on an otherwise ordinary morning. One morning, as Leah massaged Ethan's legs with peppermint oil, she felt a subtle muscle twitch beneath her fingers. She paused, looked at him, and asked gently, "Do you feel anything?" Ethan was silent for a moment, his eyes drifting down to his lower legs. Then he gave a slow nod, something like pins and needles, faint, but real. Leah smiled, the first smile in weeks that carried more than politeness. It held hope, not a fantasy, but the kind of hope you can almost touch. From that day on, she adjusted his therapy. Instead of rigid textbook routines, she relied more on instinct, adding warm compresses, changing pressure techniques, playing soft music during sessions, and most importantly, involving Sophie. Sophie was the most unexpected therapist of all. She invented the wake-up legs game. Every morning, she placed a small bell near Ethan's feet and shook it gently whenever Leah massaged him. "I think if your legs hear enough bells, they'll wake up." Ethan chuckled, his eyes softer now, no longer filled with weary resignation. He stopped counting the minutes until Leah left. Instead, he started asking, "What are we working on today?" He ate more, slept deeper. The nights were no longer filled with restless sighs, but real dreams, sometimes of Sophie's laughter, sometimes of walking beneath the sun. One afternoon, during a leg curl exercise, Ethan suddenly said, "I feel something moving, very faint." Leah didn't reply with excitement. She simply squeezed his hand gently. "Then it's starting." From that moment, every small victory was marked by another paper star from Sophie, not as a reward, but as a reminder. "You're moving toward the light." And it was true. Ethan was no longer the man slumped in silence. He began choosing real clothes over pajamas. He asked Leah to open the curtains, letting sunlight in. He looked at Leah and Sophie not like hired help or an obligation, but like people who mattered. Leah noticed, not just in the way he moved, but in the way he looked at her longer with gentler eyes. One morning, as Leah helped him sit upright, Ethan asked suddenly, "If I walk again, do you think things will change?" Leah looked at him, didn't smile, and simply said, "I think things already have, not because you'll walk, but because you've started living again." Time passed, and the once cold house had grown warm, not just from sunlight through open windows, but from the vibrant presence of Leah and Sophie. Yet, just as Ethan's heart was beginning to open, someone from the past returned, bringing with her all the memories he had buried. Sienna showed up unannounced. As the door opened, the familiar perfume filled the air. The scent that once stirred his longing now made him uncomfortable. She stood there, polished and poised, her gaze sweeping the room like a silent judgment. "I heard you're learning to walk again," she said softly, though her tone cut sharp. "Looks like you've found quite the little helper." Her eyes landed on Leah folding laundry, then drifted to Sophie playing in the corner. That glance held nothing but disdain. "So now you've hired a nanny and her sidekick?" The room froze. Ethan's hand gripped the arm of his wheelchair. Leah said nothing, calmly finishing the last shirt. But Sophie looked up, wide-eyed and confused. Ethan needed no more time. "Get out, Sienna." She gave a dry laugh. "Are you serious? Who is she to you?" Ethan drew a long breath. And then he did something Leah had never seen, something even he wasn't sure he could do. He pressed down on the arms of the chair, pushed with muscles that had only just begun to respond, and stood up, unsteady but upright, imperfect but unmistakably firm. "She's the one who stayed when you disappeared," Ethan said, his voice low but clear. "And that little girl, she's the first person who made me laugh after months of darkness." Leah turned, her eyes glistening. Sophie stood and ran to Ethan, gripping his hand tightly. Sienna stood frozen, speechless, and for the first time she understood she had truly lost him, not because he couldn't walk, but because he had stood for someone else. When the door closed behind her, Ethan collapsed back into the chair, breathing hard. Leah stepped forward, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Are you okay?" she asked gently. Ethan chuckled, sweat on his brow. "I've never felt this strong before." That night, they didn't talk much. Leah made tea. Sophie drew a picture of Ethan standing tall with a star beside his head. They sat together, quiet, grounded, and perhaps a little changed. Since the day Sienna left, there was nothing left to hide. Ethan no longer avoided Leah's eyes, nor did he pull away from Sophie's sudden hugs. Meals for three became the norm. Leah still called him Mr. Miller during work hours, but outside those hours, the way she looked at him had changed, and so had the way he looked at her. They didn't rush. No one said, "I love you," and no one labeled what was growing between them. But everything they shared, from a gentle touch, a quiet glance, to evenings spent in silence under dim light, held something sacred, something beyond definition. Sophie remained the gentle bridge between them. She kept adding paper stars for each of Ethan's small victories. One day, when he walked 3 steps without the walker, Sophie shouted, "Mr. Ethan's about to become a superhero." Leah and Ethan both burst into laughter. And within that laughter, there was something deeper than joy, a release, a quiet declaration, "We're truly living now." One evening, after tucking Sophie into bed, Ethan and Leah sat on the porch. The air was crisp. Leah wrapped a scarf around his shoulders, then sat beside him. Ethan looked at her directly. "I don't know how to say this, but if you'll have me, I want this to be forever." Leah didn't answer right away. She simply took his hand, those hands once cold with despair, now slowly warming. "I think it already began a long time ago." The next morning, Sophie skipped through the house, announcing to her imaginary kingdom, "Mom and Mr. Ethan are getting married. Everyone has to dress fancy." Ethan laughed. Leah blushed, but neither of them denied it, because what they had wasn't just love. It was a family. They didn't have a lavish wedding. No designer gowns, no grand cathedral, no glamorous bridal party. Just a soft afternoon sun in the backyard, a few close friends, some wildflowers gathered from the woods, and a checkered tablecloth laid over a folding table. But in that space, they had everything they needed to begin something eternal. Ethan sat on a wooden chair under a maple tree, sunlight streaming gently through the leaves onto his shoulders. Leah stepped out from the house in a light white dress, her hair tied back with a pale blue ribbon. Simple, yet breathtakingly serene. Sophie was the sole bridesmaid, in a pastel pink princess dress, clutching a bouquet of flowers she had picked herself. Every step she took across the grass came with a giggle that echoed through the yard. Leah reached Ethan's side. He looked up at her, his eyes slowly brightening, as if seeing the most beautiful thing in his life. Not Leah in a wedding dress, but Leah, the woman who had walked beside him through his darkest days. "I once thought no one could ever love someone like me again," Ethan whispered, voice trembling. Leah squeezed his hand, smiling. I'm not loving someone like you. I'm loving you. Their officiant was an elderly neighbor who had brought over banana bread when Leah first moved in. Her voice was deep and kind as she read the vows, holding an old notebook she always used for special occasions. When Ethan and Leah exchanged rings, Sophie shouted, "They're married! We're officially a family now!" Ethan laughed, pulling Leah and Sophie into his arms. The three of them hugged tightly, surrounded by applause. No tuxedos, no glitter, but every cheer was genuine. That night, Leah sat on a garden bench, head resting on Ethan's shoulder. Sophie lay asleep in their arms after a day filled with joy. A cool breeze passed by, carrying the scent of mint from the backyard. Ethan whispered, "Thank you for staying." Leah squeezed his hand gently and replied, "We chose each other, didn't we?" Ethan once thought his walking days were over. He had accepted that part of him was gone forever. When the accident happened, doctors told him the chances of full recovery were slim, next to none. At first, he believed them. He had lived as someone who had accepted fate, who let go of everything he thought was out of reach. But now, each morning, he stood, not just to train, but to live. Leah turned the living room into a mini rehab center. Wooden handrails lined the walls, soft mats cushioned the floor. A countdown chart tracked his progress, and in one corner, Sophie's Victory Star board stood proudly. Sophie was the coach, cheerleader, and comic relief all in one. "Mr. Ethan, today we battle the final boss," she shouted as he took his first steps of the day. At first, Ethan relied on a walker, then crutches. Slowly, his legs responded faster, less stiff, less painful. Every step was a declaration. I'm still here. I'm still whole. One quiet afternoon, while Ethan walked laps around the yard and Sophie ran circles around him, Leah stood in the doorway, pride shining in her eyes. Ethan stopped, sweat soaking his shirt, but his smile was brighter than ever. "It feels like I'm picking up pieces of myself," he exhaled. Leah stepped closer, dabbing his forehead. "You never lost them. They were just waiting to be called back." Sophie burst in between them, holding a new drawing, this time a superhero flying through the sky. No wheelchair in sight. "Mr. Ethan is now Ultra Mega Version," they all laughed. But then came a day, a special day, that marked a milestone none of them had dared to expect. Sophie's 7th birthday. The party was small, held in the backyard. There were balloons, cake, and a tiny table filled with hand-drawn gifts from her friends. Leah was busy setting things up. Sophie twirled around in a sea-blue princess dress. Ethan sat on the porch, watching everything with a quiet peace. Then, as Sophie danced and sang in the center of the yard, he placed both hands on the chair arms and stood up. No assistance, no walker, no crutches. He walked step by step toward her, through golden sunlight and gasps of awe. Sophie turned, stunned, then screamed, "Mom, Mr. Ethan's walking!" Leah spun around. Tears spilled instantly. She raised a hand to her mouth, speechless. Ethan knelt, arms open. Sophie rushed into his embrace, arms tight around his neck like she was afraid he'd vanish. "You did it. You really did it." Ethan said nothing. He just closed his eyes, breathing in deep. In that moment, there was no injury, no history, no pain. Only 3 hearts, 1 hug, and the most beautiful victory of all. Ethan never returned to the tech world. He had once possessed fame, fortune, and applause-filled speeches. But now all he wanted was to slow down and live closer to his heart. With Leah, they founded a nonprofit called Rooted Forward, a center that helped people with disabilities recover both physically and emotionally, especially those lost in isolation after trauma. "We don't just help them walk again, we help them believe they're still worth living for," Ethan once said during the first team meeting. Leah led the holistic care program, supported by volunteers who were once patients themselves. And Sophie, now a young woman, became the soul of the Children's Initiative. She always opened her sessions with, "Once upon a time, there was a man who couldn't walk, but then he learned how to fly." Ethan didn't fly, but in his own way, he soared. He lifted others by helping them rise on their own feet. The house that once held silence now served as their organization's headquarters. In the garden, Sophie had strung paper stars all along the fence, each star a story of someone who had been healed. Their little family never needed to be perfect by the world's standards. They only needed to be true, to love, to give, and to share quietly the best parts of themselves. That was Ethan's legacy, not wealth, not accolades, but a deep and simple truth, that love can move people forward, even from the deepest fall. Life passed quietly. Everything came and went like a river, sometimes slow, sometimes swift, but never still. Ethan and Leah grew old together, not in some cinematic way, but in the way real people do, through peaceful mornings with coffee, evenings spent watching Sophie grow, and wrinkles that crept in slowly, but never dimmed the way they looked at each other. Sophie grew up carrying both the innocence of her childhood and the depth of what she had witnessed. She was no longer the girl who rang bells to wake Ethan's legs. She became a woman who knew how to heal, like her mother, like Ethan. One autumn afternoon, as soft light spilled across the garden, Ethan sat in his familiar old chair. Leah sat beside him, her hand tucked into his. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. That was the last time Ethan sat there. He passed in his sleep as peacefully as a bird leaving the sky after flying long enough. Leah didn't cry. She held his hand tighter, whispered, "Thank you for standing up, for staying." The funeral was small and warm, no elaborate flowers, no long speeches. Just Sophie, reading aloud the first letter she ever wrote to Mr. Ethan when she was 7, and a final line that brought tears to every eye. He's not here anymore, but every step someone takes because of his love is still him, walking on. And so, a life that began in loss ended in love, quietly, but with depth that never fades. And somewhere, in every star pinned on that garden fence, he still walks on. Some journeys don't begin with a step forward, they begin with a fall. And some love stories don't start with a spark, but with the quiet moments when no one else seems to see us. Ethan, Leah, and Sophie weren't family by blood. They became one because they chose to stay when it would have been easier to leave. They chose to love when the world might have already forgotten. We don't need superpowers to fly. Sometimes all it takes is someone who believes we still deserve to. If you're walking through your darkest days, please remember, the light hasn't disappeared. It's just waiting for you to step toward it. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. If this story moved you, even just a little, hit the like button, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of quiet healing and second chances. Because maybe next time, the story will be yours.